So what we're going to talk about today is triangulation in qualitative research. We're going to talk about the different definitions of triangulation, what it means, the different types of triangulation, how you can kind of approach it, and then very concretely, what does it look like? So we'll kind of address those three areas. There's a lot more. You could probably teach, a full day or maybe even a full weekend on triangulation and the different approaches. We're going to kind of hit the highlights here today and how I, just from my 5 years here at Seton Hall, have seen it applied kind of most concretely in students' dissertations, what they do. Again, please feel free to jump in with questions as we go through this. So before we even get into defining what triangulation is, and again, I know this is a lot of words, you don't have to write this down, I will share this, and this should look familiar for some of you who have had me in class. But the reason we are going to talk about triangulation is it's this idea of lending credibility to your research. You talk a lot about validity and reliability in quantitative research, and certainly those terms are used in qualitative research too, although they're applied a little bit differently. Oftentimes in qualitative research, you will, if you're reading articles about it, researchers, there is some debate on what term you should use, but credibility is basically the internal validity of your study. What are you doing? Because the researcher is so involved in qualitative research, you determine the research questions, you decide what data that you'll collect. You are oftentimes developing your interview questions or your survey protocols, or you're doing the observation, you're collecting, you're so intimately involved with the data that there needs to be some kind of internal validity check that everything you are doing is valid or at least credible, as it's often said. And that's why we use this term credibility. And triangulation is one specific way to get at credibility of research. And we'll talk about why that is here in a moment. But that's why triangulation is such an important topic and worth presenting today, I think. The other term that I wanted to bring up first is dependability. Again, you don't have to memorize this or commit this to memory, but depending on what you're reading and how you approach your own research, you might see this term come up. Unlike quantitative research, which is meant to be replicable, like if you were to take data from 1980 and you did the same set of statistical analyses with the same data, same controlling for the same variables, and you did that analysis today, you should get the same results. The numbers don't change. In qualitative research, that is basically impossible to do. Even if two people were collecting the same data, even from the same people or group of people, they might get very different results because maybe somebody's much more comfortable confiding in Carmen when she's interviewing them than they are with me. So they might respond differently to the person. There's a lot more of the human element in qualitative research. So it's very difficult to replicate data. You couldn't replicate the same study, a year down the road because so many things have changed. If you interview somebody if we were to interview one of you in March of 2020 about the pivot to remote learning, your responses about how that went might be very different than they are today. Even though you're the same person, a lot has changed in those years. So it's difficult to replicate a qualitative study. So we really seek to work towards this internal validity. How can the data I'm collecting now, how can I demonstrate that it's valid or credible for my specific set of data that I'm collecting for my study? It's very difficult to remain completely objective as you're collecting quantitative research. There's qualitative research, I should say. There are steps you can take, and those of you, we're not going to get into these topics today, but you might remember things like including things like positionality statements. That's, how your past experiences might influence what you're looking for, why you were even interested in this topic in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line is researchers in qualitative research bring their own perspectives when they're collecting data. And because of that, the questions that you ask, and most importantly and relevant to today, how you interpret what is said or what the data that is collected can be different. Scott and I might look at the same interview transcript and come away with different findings, different interpretation of what was said, or not even, what was said, but what stood out to us more. He might have thought, X, Y, and Z was really the most important. I might think of something else based on our own past and experiences. And it's acknowledged that this is a limitation of qualitative research, but it's important to know that going in so you can address these things in your research. So I just gave you a lot of terminology that we use for credibility. In qualitative validity, you're really trying to accurately represent the data that you collect in the simplest terms. So if you're interviewing 10 school principals about something, if you were to give your dissertation to those 10 principals and they were to read it, does it accurately represent what they were telling you? So that's really your goal in qualitative research, is to accurately represent the phenomenon or the people that make up the data of your study. So how do you do this? There's lots of strategies you can use. You can use peer debriefing. That means pretty much you don't do everything by yourself. You could use your mentor or a colleague to kind of read over transcripts or review surveys with you to kind of make sure that you're not missing anything or to see if different insights might come up. You can collect multiple sources of data, documents, raw artifacts that are more objective in nature, that you were not, writing down your field notes. This is a policy that was given to teachers. It's kind of black and white. That's one way to do it. Many of you will remember we talked about member checks, and that's kind of what I just mentioned on the last slide. It's at the end of your study or at different points of your study, following up with your participants to check in with them, to ask clarifying questions if something comes up, to ask them actually, does this portray what you were trying to tell me, et cetera, et cetera. Things like establishing an audit trail. That means really tracking and documenting everything that you've done, from how you formulated questions to how you collected data, and then your analytic process. Another big one is practicing reflexivity, and that's really, soul searching a little bit into your own assumptions and biases and how those things might influence everything from why you were interested in this topic in the first place, to the questions that you asked, to what you're looking for in the data. And then to bring it full circle, and the point of today's presentation is triangulation is one of the best things I would argue you could do to protect that credibility or qualitative validity that we're talking about. So what is triangulation? Triangulation is usually using multiple methods, usually data collection methods, to develop a more complete picture and cross-check information. So we'll look exactly at what that means here with this good, clear definition. So Patton, who I use in some of the classes, basically I think has the most commonly used definition of triangulation, and that's the use of multiple methods or data sources to develop a comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon under study. So very practically, that can mean if you're interested in how the teacher's perceptions of what it was like to transition to remote learning in the early stages of the pandemic, you might, of course, want to talk to teachers, right? You're interested in their perception, so you could talk to them. You might also be interested in what it's like from the principal's perspective, so you could talk to him or her and see what they think. You might also talk to parents of the students who had to experience this as well. And that way you would be engaging in participant triangulation, where you're collecting data from 3 different participants who are experiencing the same phenomenon. Teachers, parents, and principals might have very different perspectives on what that process was like, and that's potentially very interesting. Or potentially they all had the same experience. Maybe they're all like, it was a disaster. We didn't have the infrastructure, technology didn't work, all these different things. And then that's interesting. So it's not just like the teachers are saying it, but kind of the teachers are saying it, the parents are saying it, the principals are saying it. It strengthens what you're trying to say a little bit. That's the point of triangulation, is trying to strengthening the findings that you're writing about in your dissertation. And again, please jump in with questions. I know I'm talking a lot. So I just gave an example of participant triangulation. There's basically 4 types of triangulation. And within these, there's kind of more nuance to each of them, but we'll go over these very briefly. There's method triangulation. Was someone going to say something? Okay, there's method triangulation, which is using different methodological approaches to tackle the same research questions. So you might hear of it as mixed methods a little bit. They're related, certainly, where you could collect quantitative data and look for the relationships amongst 2 or more variables and see the strength of the relationships. And you could say that, when a school adopted an after-school reading program, 3rd grade reading scores went up. You can see there's a relationship between those 2 things. You can't necessarily say that one caused the other. Causation is very difficult to prove, but through qualitative research, you could potentially get closer to that answer, and you could interview teachers who were involved in that after-school program and say, hey, do you attribute student success on the 3rd grade reading scores to this program? And if the quantitative data says there's a relationship between these things, you have teachers saying, yeah, this after-school program we adopted was great, I've never seen students reading better, then you could be more confident in saying that, yeah, this after-school program really had a good impact, a strong impact on student test scores. That's method triangulation. Investigator triangulation, you likely won't use for your dissertation, but you could potentially use. That's kind of what it sounds like. You as the investigator, the researcher. There's more than one of you. Oftentimes in the studies that you'll read for your literature review or whatever, you'll see there are research teams, multiple authors on the same study. Investigator triangulation could come into play there. I've been on research teams where multiple of us read the same surveys or interviews or interview transcripts, etc., and see what our findings, if they relate or if they don't. Theory triangulation, that's using different theories to examine your study. And then the last one, and what we're going to talk about most today, because that's the most common used one, I would argue, of students in our programs, is data source triangulation. So that's collecting different sources of data from the same group of people or to investigate the same phenomenon. There's really two main approaches that I would say are most common here in data source triangulation. So there's participant triangulation. That's what I just mentioned before with the transition to remote learning example I gave. But participant triangulation is the collection of data from different types of people, including individuals, groups, families, communities, to gain multiple perspectives on a specific topic or a phenomenon. So if you're really interested in better understanding some phenomenon that's experienced by multiple people, participant triangulation might be a good way to go. Triangulation, I should mention, is not required, and it might not be right for every study. But if you're really interested in, some specific phenomenon, whether it's a type of reading program that was adopted, a pivot to remote learning, how students are considering, which college to attend, it might be interesting to get the student's perspective, the parent's perspective, the counselor's perspective, and kind of triangulate those perspectives in that way could really add a rich nuance to your data. And then source triangulation, the other one that's very common, is collecting multiple sources of data from participants in the study to gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of a specific topic or phenomenon. So what this might look like, I can use my dissertation as an example, which wasn't too long ago. It was when teacher evaluation stuff was really hot and a lot of states were changing the way they evaluated teachers. So as part of my source triangulation, I observed teachers as they were being evaluated by their principals. I went into the classes back when you could go into the classrooms. I went into the classrooms and watched the observation happen. I interviewed the teacher after about what they thought about not only the observation, but the evaluation process in general. And then I was lucky enough to actually get their final evaluation score from the principal, what they got on their score. This was done in Michigan. So I was able to triangulate in the way where I talked to teachers about the experience. I observed with my own eyes what I thought was happening during the evaluation. And then I could see what transpired in their final rating. And I could kind of see, did those things match up? I would ask teachers such as, do you think this observation accurately represents your effectiveness as an educator? And if they say no, it was way off base, and then what I observed either matched or didn't match that, you can kind of really add some depth to your finding by collecting those multiple sources of data, studying one person or a group of people. Any questions about those two overarching types of triangulation? So I just provided a couple examples. I know I've given you some already, but let's say this is a very timely example. Let's say a researcher, you are interested in better understanding how a school district trained and supported teachers when the district shifted to completely virtual or remote learning. An example of this in participant triangulation might be you might plan to answer the school principal. What is his or her perspective on how this district and his or her school supported teachers in this process? You might want to get the teacher's perspective, I would argue, because they are the ones probably most directly involved. And then you might also interview district technology specialists. And, if like the school principal and the district technology specialist said, we couldn't have been more supportive, once we figured out that we were going remote learning, we offered, these different PDs, trainings, all these things all the time. And then the teachers say, we didn't receive any support, actually. We were kind of left on our own. Unless we really spoke up, we were kind of left to figure it out. That's potentially really interesting because those perspectives are very different over the same topic. Alternatively, if all the perspectives line up, that's potentially very interesting too. You can say pretty confidently that this school or this district did a good or a poor job transitioning to virtual or remote learning. You're not just taking, let's say, the school principal's word for it and what he or she is telling you happened, but you kind of have like second and third sources from the teacher and district technology specialists, especially if they're mentioning the same things. Like, yes, we offered this training on this date. We used, this company to help. We use these things. You can really say, from different groups of people, you can really better understand your question or be more confident in your findings and analysis by getting those multiple sources analyzed. Source triangulation with the same example. You could collect a bunch of data, and of course this is a timely topic, but you could survey the teachers about their perspectives on perceptions on how the district supported them in this transition. After the survey, you could interview those same teachers, and then you could collect documents, let's say from the district, related to training or supporting teachers, and use those 3 different data sources to kind of answer the same research question. So one is participant, one is source. Okay, so those of you who have had me in class probably remember I don't like to talk too much, but does any brave soul, even though knowing this is recorded, want to volunteer an example or two? I'd love to hear from you all about your current study. Maybe you're far along, maybe you're in the early stages, but just briefly, what are you studying, and how could you apply either participant triangulation or source triangulation? Who might you talk to, or what data might you collect? You could put up a virtual hand or just jump in, either way. Lisa, yes.
So I was looking at reading interventions and professional development. So when I think about that, definitely the gen ed teachers, but I also think the instructional support teachers who normally are the struggling learners' primary teacher, and also guidance counselors. Guidance counselors sit on our intervention and referral system and our RTI framework. So it'd be interesting to see what their perspective was of the PD and the training that the teachers got, because they didn't participate in it, but they're in the meetings where we talk about the interventions and we talk about the data. So they know about it, but from a different perspective.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Yep. Thank you, Lisa. Good example. Anyone else? Okay. Well, please. Yeah, please. Thank you.
I'm doing a
Thanks, Scott.
qualitative study of what the process of accommodations review looks like at 14 New York City area independent schools. And what I'm particularly interested in is what the perceptions of the process are of those who are involved in the process, and doing some triangulation with document review. And so seeing, for example, what independent school community communications about accommodations review looks like, and where there may be gaps between those 2 things: participant perception and community communications.
Great. Thank you. That's another good example. Absolutely. Thanks, Scott. Anyone else? One thing I want to mention too is triangulation. We often, think of 3, of course, triangle. But triangulation can involve more than 3 of these things. It can involve 2 as well. Like you might want to survey a group of teachers about something and then interview a subset of those teachers potentially to kind of gain, you see these trends and patterns emerge from the survey data, but you want to ask some more kind of nuanced, in-depth questions based on that data. That's fine as well. So it doesn't always have to be like a neat 3 triangle, although that's most common, how you'll see it written about in everything. That's the goal. There's no right or wrong, like a lot of qualitative research, there's no exact prescribed way how to do this or exact numbers. It doesn't always need to be neat and tidy. Like you won't always get 10 interviews, 10 surveys, 10 documents you can analyze. If you get like 10 surveys, 8 interviews, 5 documents, that's still working towards triangulation, of course. So it doesn't always need to be neat and tidy like that. Same thing with participants. If you're able to interview 10 teachers, 7 principals, 5 parents, that's still working towards triangulation. Of course, you would write up all this in your chapter 3 when you're talking about your data collection and stuff, but it's not always, a perfect, neat and tidy. So that's fine. But the goal is you're working towards talking to multiple people or collecting multiple sources of data to better address your research question. And that kind of dovetails nicely into the next slide. So why do we do this? What is the point other than adding some credibility to your data, into your analysis? Why go through this process, or why write it about it this way? These are some commonly held beliefs about why good qualitative research consists of, or triangulation is used in good qualitative research. So data from different sources, different methods, as we mentioned, investigators and so on, will produce evidence that will result in a single proposition about some social phenomenon. So basically, that means there could be some convergence in everything that you're collecting. Like in Scott's example, if all the documents he is collecting say the same thing, or they share similar themes as he's analyzing, that potentially adds strength to his study. Whereas if you just collected one set of documents from one group of people, you're getting it from multiple sources, is one way to think of it. Relatedly, but kind of on the flip side, it can point out inconsistencies. I kind of mentioned this in a couple of my examples, but if a bunch of people have experienced the same phenomenon, but their perceptions of it are different, that's potentially interesting too. If you talk to teachers about something that's going on in school, they might have a very different perception of how it is played out than school leadership or than parents or something like that. And then related to inconsistency is the contradiction. So that would be basically an opposing view of the social phenomenon. So whatever you're studying, maybe people see it very differently. And that's potentially interesting too, and very practically, and especially because I think so many of you want to know how to, after your study's over, how can you apply this to either your district, your organization? What can I do with this? Basically, the practical implications. I think, school leaders, for example, would want to know if they really believed one thing, like new teacher evaluation policies were great. They better distinguished teachers. They gave teachers better feedback on their performance, et cetera. That's what principals thought. But then teachers were like, no, this didn't help me at all. Like, I didn't get better because of this at all. I think that would be good for leaders to know, the perceptions of different people involved in different phenomenons. And I apologize to the higher ed folks. I know my background's in K-12, so I sometimes am not great at providing higher ed examples. I tried with the college choosing, but please feel free to share some of your examples too from your dissertations. But anyway, that's kind of why we do this, is to kind of help strengthen our findings through multiple sources, identify, unearth some inconsistencies or contradictions that might exist that you wouldn't find if you just collected data from one group of people or from one data source. I mentioned this at the beginning too, but we also engage in triangulation because in qualitative research, reasonable people will come up with different findings. Unlike quantitative research that really looks at that replicability and, you can use the same data set, and if you do everything the same, you would get the same outputs. In social science research, qualitative research, there's no one truth or meaning. And it's very likely that Carmen and I could go into a classroom and observe a teacher doing something and really latch on to different things. Maybe I'm really invested in how the teacher is choosing how he or she calls on students, and Carmen's looking at how the students are interacting with each other. And we observe the same lesson but come away with very different things. Neither one of them is right or wrong, but just what catches our eye or what we're looking for is different. That's very real. And that will happen in qualitative research. If we were to read the same newspaper article, let's see, two of us might, we might know what the article's about, but we might come away with a different takeaway, kind of a highlight. So while there's no one right meaning, there are ways to kind of prescribe, and this is from the Miles text that I use sometimes in class, Miles et al. There are quote unquote wrong meanings, things you should try to avoid as you're engaging in this analysis. And I should say this is true whether you're engaging in triangulation or not. But sometimes they call it the holistic fantasy, and that's interpreting events and patterns that aren't there. And that would look like if you think that a participant or that says something or that you're reading something that really maybe supports kind of something that you believe or you've experienced from your professional world, kind of looking at overemphasizing that event or making kind of a leap to a conclusion that really isn't there. So you want to make sure you approach data analysis very objectively. In a related vein, there's this thing called elite bias, which is overvaluing certain participants because it supports your thinking or theory. Like maybe you think that districts did a, not a great job supporting teachers during this transition to remote learning. You might, if you have one or two teachers out of, say, the 20 that you interview who are really speaking poorly about what the district support that they got, you can't overvalue those participants because that's 2 out of your 20 participants. Just because they might be the loudest voices doesn't mean the most representative. So you kind of need to give equal weight to the participants in your study and not just go in looking for those people or the data that supports what you're trying to say. It's very, and this goes back to some of the things we talked about at the beginning, it's very difficult to go in kind of completely objective. You're likely pursuing some research topic that you're interested in because you've either experienced it, it's impacting your professional career right now, you want to know more about it yourself, and you probably have some thoughts about it. I mean, in my experience with my dissertation, I had some thought. I was a former teacher and then instructional coach charged with supporting teachers as we adopted a new teacher evaluation system. So I had some thoughts about how effectively or ineffectively all of this kind of training and I would call craziness was, but I couldn't go in there and just assume that everyone felt the same way I did. You have to really be open to different alternatives, theories, ways of thinking. And they might be completely different, right, than what you think, and that's okay. This is not your perception of what you're studying. This is the data that you're collecting from your participants. And again, relatedly, I kind of got into this next one, personal bias. So something in your past influences your analysis. Like you shouldn't really be out to prove something in qualitative research. It might end up being true if you have thoughts that, all these changes, the teacher evaluations resulted in no meaningful change and just made teachers fill out a bunch more paperwork. That might ultimately be true and come through in the analysis, but that shouldn't influence how you go about your analysis. Going native is when you work so closely with participants or kind of get so invested or involved in the phenomenon that they are experiencing or going through, you kind of lose your perspective and ability to be objective. So these are just some things to keep in mind as you're going through any type of qualitative analysis. And triangulation really helps kind of prevent this a little bit, if you will. It's not a cure-all. It's not to say if you collect 3 types of data from 3 different participants around a phenomenon that all of these things go away, that you can't have elite bias. Of course you could, but it kind of helps get at that from getting those multiple data sources. It helps combat some of these things. Any questions? Okay, a couple final things to consider before I want to wrap up with some questions and just one final example about how this can apply is triangulation, I would argue, is good and can generally support most studies. Again, a lot of this depends on your framing. It all goes back to your research questions. Those of you who have had me in class have heard this a bunch of times. But you shouldn't just say you're engaging in triangulation for no reason. You need to explicitly discuss and think about first, but then discuss in your actual writing. How does each type of data source or participant that you're talking to or the data that you're collecting help you address your research question? If it doesn't make sense for you to talk to parents about your topic because you're not interested in their perspective, maybe their perspective is super interesting and important, but it doesn't relate to what you want to know, you shouldn't just interview parents just because, oh, that's more interviews to do or more data to look through. It should be intentional, the type of data that you're collecting and why you are triangulating together. How can one piece of data inform another piece of data, which can ultimately help you address your research question? We talk about this a lot in qualitative research too, is more is not always better. You should be deliberate and intentional about the data that you collect. That might seem obvious, but it's not always in quantitative research, more is not always better either, but usually we talk about larger sample sizes, getting as many people as possible to return a survey, those things. And certainly it's difficult to do a qualitative dissertation with like one interview. You probably couldn't just have one interview, of course, but in qualitative research, you can get a lot more creative. We've had really successful dissertations from students who have, 2 or 3 participants in their study for various reasons, but they collect lots of different types of data from these individuals, or they follow these individuals along throughout the course of a school year, and they interview them at the beginning, every month, every 2 months, and kind of along the school year through their journey. So they might only have 2 participants, but they still have 20 interviews because they interviewed each person 10 times for whatever reason. So one of the strengths and cool things about qualitative research is you can kind of get creative about the types of data and the amount of data that you collect. Again, this should all obviously be worked out with your committee and things like that. And I presented here today the most common ones, observations, surveys, interviews, documents are very common, but there's a host more types of data that you can collect. You can get really creative with what you collect. I'm doing just one quick example from my own research. I'm working on a project too about kind of the evolving, this was even before COVID, but the evolving job expectations of school principals. And basically me and my colleagues are making this point that it's becoming a much more outward facing job. Yes, you're still responsible for teaching and learning, but increasingly you're expected to, go, this has always been the case a little bit, but, basically, go to athletic events, monitor social media, do these outward facing like marketing and recruiting, branding your school, talk to parents, like convince these things. Of course, principals have always done that, but that's becoming more of their role, we argue. It's this kind of outward, what you do outside of the school kind of matters more, and how parents perceive that is more important than kind of how you, do your more traditionally defined roles of developing teachers. Those type of things is what we're kind of finding. So anyway, one of the pieces of data that I collect was I wanted to know how much of this principals were actually doing. So we asked them to just document it. So we would send them an email Sunday night being like, okay, can you send us what you plan to do, today during the workday? They would send us what they were planning to do roughly, 9 to 10 in teachers' classrooms, 10 to 11, blah, blah, blah. And then they'd email us on Wednesday about what they actually did. And it was really interesting. It was kind of a unique way to approach it because really it was interesting that they thought they were going to be in a classroom from 9 to 10, but something came up during the day that pushed something else, and they ended up working all these kind of non-traditional hours, after school and before school, and they often involved, meeting with parents, community members about these different things that kind of took them out of the school, basically. Anyway, that's just one example, and that's a little off topic, but you're able to collect lots of different pieces of data beyond these kind of traditional interview, survey, documents, and qualitative research. And really the key is just how do the pieces of data inform each other? So if you're interested in the phenomenon, you would likely collect multiple sources of data or talk to multiple people. And then how can that really strengthen your study is kind of the key for triangulation. Again, you'll read, and I think those of you who have had me recently, I started sharing, dissertations, qualitative dissertations that have been recommended by faculty. Not everybody uses triangulation. You can use, in qualitative research, you could potentially just interview, 20 people, and that's completely fine. But oftentimes, depending on what you want to study, triangulation can really help lend some credence, lend to that internal validity we talked about at the beginning.